Buongiorno, and welcome to a very spooky episode of the podcast We Like Comics Because They Have No Bones. I'm Joe Getcho.
And I'm Miguel Blanco. This is a clean comic book podcast where we discuss and review comics by DC, Marvel, Image, Dark Horse, IDW, and more. You can find us on social media at Boneless Comics 1 on Twitter and at Boneless Comics Podcast pretty much everywhere else.
And don't forget to check out our website at bonelesscomicspodcast.com with more information about the podcast, links to places to listen to previous episodes, and a link to our YouTube channel where if you're listening to this episode and you're not watching it on YouTube, that's totally cool, but you're missing out on some cool visuals. So make sure to stop by our YouTube channel and watch video episodes and find additional bonus content.
Yeah, you're really missing out this time because Joe has really, for those of you just listening, Joe has like completed the Gomez Addams look, which is
we
appropriate.
Dance the mamushka.
Yes, cara mia.
Cara mia.
Cara
today, because today we are discussing the Addams Family issues number 1 through 3, published in 1974 by Gold Key Comics.
That is right. So the Addams Family, going all the way back to 1938, was created by Charles Addams as a cartoon print in The New Yorker, an American weekly magazine featuring journalism, commentary, criticism, essays, fiction, satire, cartoons, and poetry. So there's a lot of stuff in this magazine. And one of the first things in 1938 was, well, actually it wasn't first because it was in October, but anyway, was the Addams Family cartoon, though they weren't called the Addams Family when they first appeared. Originally, they were just a group of separate characters that were featured in individual gags, but eventually they got paired together. Most of the cartoons didn't even have any written dialogue, or they may have just included like a punchline in the captions. And the characters really didn't have any developed personalities and didn't even have names until the TV adaptation in 1964. So a lot of what we get as the sort of modern Addams Family came from the TV adaptation, not the original comic. So
interesting. I don't mean to interject for too long, but I was just thinking the other like comic strip that I am familiar with that didn't use a lot of dialogue, especially early on, is Garfield, which ran for, I don't know if it's still running. It ran for a really long time, but those were often just sequential panels with maybe a punchline at the end. So it's very much in that like comic strip format as opposed to monthly comic books, which is what we would normally be talking about here.
Yeah. So another thing to note about this episode is if you hear random laughing and you're just listening to the podcast episode, I'm making faces into the camera. So if Mike laughs, but we didn't say something funny, that would be why. So just
definitely check this one out on YouTube.
So the 3-issue comic series that we're going to review today was actually written as an adaptation, again, but to the 1970s animated series episodes Bula Bula, The Addams Family New York, and Left in the Lurch. So these were animated series by Hanna-Barbera, and really Charles Addams didn't have any involvement in this. And this was kind of more to, get the kid audience into, partaking of the humor of the Addams Family. So we do have a writer, an American comic book and television writer, Mark Evanier, who is credited with scripting the series in the Who's Who of American comic books, but there's no reference to it in his own Gold Key checklist or in the comics themselves. And he even went on to clarify later he did not write number 1 of this series. So it's almost like an unsolved mystery where the Addamses are concerned.
Join me. Perhaps you may be able to help solve a mystery.
So it's funny that you mentioned Garfield because Mark Evanier is actually known for his work on animated TV series, most notably Garfield and Friends.
Oh, wow.
And he's also done some work as a historian and biographer of the comics industry, such as his award-winning Jack Kirby biography, Kirby, King of Comics.
So I have not read that biography, but I have several. There's a foreword in my Fourth World Omnibus that Kirby wrote and drew in the 70s. You're making it really hard to concentrate. By Mark Evanier. So that makes sense. I guess that was maybe just like an excerpt from that book. But We do have a confirmation of who the artist is for this. So
Yes.
Bill Ziegler, born in 1925, was active from the 1950s through 1951, first working professionally on the Annie Oakley Sunday cartoon strip. So again, we're mostly talking about what we're reviewing today are comic books in the traditional sense, but these are usually comic strips when it refers to the Addams Family. So usually we're talking about like that 3-panel layout or maybe like a larger layout for like the Sunday edition or whatever. But kind of what you would see growing up as a kid in the 80s, 90s, and obviously even before that. Throughout the 50s, Ziegler was associated with comic strips such as Dragnet and Mary Worth, the latter which he inked for 16 years. And
Wow.
I could not find confirmation if the Dragnet TV show came first or the comic strip came first, but I know that there was like a sort of like a crime drama Dragnet TV show in like the 60s, so that I don't know which
Mhm.
predated what, but I had heard of that. Mary Worth was a daily serialized comic strip that functioned similarly to a soap opera, where each day a few new panels would expand the story. It continues to this day and is published via the Washington Post with an 8-decade-long history. And
Wow.
Stan Lee actually also did a similar style of Spider-Man strip for the newspapers for many, many years after his association with Marvel was kind
Hmm.
of over. So, also during the 70s, Ziegler worked for Dell Comics, penciling stories for Disney, such as Escape to Witch Mountain, and also for Gold Key Comics, working on Grimm's Ghost Stories and Addams Family, which of course we're reviewing today. And then from 1985 until 1991, he went back to working on the Mary Worth strip, this time as the primary penciler until 2 years before his death in 1993. So it sounds like he lived a long life, and mostly it was in that
Mhm.
sort of comic strip, newspaper strip field.
Must have been fun to stay in it that long.
I don't know. I mean, or a good paycheck. I know that
Yeah, that
the
too.
people at the top end of that field make a lot more money than like a traditional comic book artist would. It's always the struggle of are your strips syndicated in the newspaper, sort of like they would talk about with TV syndication, but I know like the Calvin and Hobbes creator Bill Watterson was a millionaire by the time his 10 years ended.
Mhm.
But I don't think that's typical of people in that field, but my understanding is that at least in the past they used to be paid pretty well. So,
Well, and hopefully, once they start making animated series and TV adaptations and
yeah.
films, you start getting those royalty checks, and that certainly can help add
Oh
that as
yeah.
well. We need to come up with an original character.
We really do. Like the Banana Man.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if he's original though. There's a lot of banana related cartoons.
There's Banana Joe, the movie. But
Isn't that a sunscreen?
no, I don't think it's a sunscreen. It might be a
Ah.
sunscreen. I don't know.
Well, speaking of original characters, let's talk about the characters of the Addams family. So we have Gomez Addams. He's the father figure. He's a shady-eyed, goofy-looking multimillionaire. His wife is Morticia Addams, an attractive but stern and aloof witch. They are passionately in love, calling each other cara mia, which is Italian for my love or my darling. They have a daughter and son, Wednesday and Pugsley. They often torture each other and kill each other, but without permanent harm. So you see a lot of panels with them doing all kinds of very lethal activities to each other, but they always come back in the
Mhm.
next, story or panel or whatever.
Like
We
to play
also
with the
have,
guillotine a lot, I feel
yeah,
like.
yeah, like, but nobody comes back with it with any missing limbs or anything like that,
No.
or severed limbs. So we also have Uncle Fester, who is a boogeyman. He loves being tortured and can generate electric power by sticking a light bulb in his mouth. In the 1964 TV series, it was actually established that Fester was Morticia's uncle, but in the 90s films, he's depicted as Gomez's brother instead, and then that's the version that we've had ever since.
Hmm.
We also have Grandmama, who is Morticia's mother, who is also a witch. And I think it makes sense that if you have, one relative for one character, then you have a different relative for a different character, rather than having them, both be related to Morticia. So maybe that's why they made that change. I don't know, but
Yeah, the
from
grandma character is not really featured in the 90s movies that I recall. Is she there, but she's kind of backgrounded for the most part? Because
um,
I don't have a real strong memory of her.
I mean, she's definitely there. She's got the crazy, you know,
Oh
witch,
yeah.
like cackle, and the way she's like, I forget, she was making some brew or food or something, and she's like, oh, this will be ready soon. She's more like the, you know, typical, like, you know, the older, like plump witch who's just like, I got something great for you. And it's actually, you know, acid or something horrible.
Right.
They also have a butler who is a grumbling giant named Lurch, who resembles Frankenstein's monster. And then they also have another servant who's named Thing, who is a crawling hand. And he is just a disembodied hand. Yes.
Well,
Or an arm.
We'll see as we get into the story, because he has an arm in some of these comics. So
he's actually, I think, in a box, right? And he's like an arm out of a box.
The arm comes out of the box, and then the hand is attached to it and doing all kinds of shenanigans.
That might have been another retcon where they're like, we want him to be able to do more on his own instead of using this box. And so maybe they just turn him into a hand. I think even in the modern stuff, he's got like, you know, a little bit of his wrist, maybe just like a little bit.
Yeah, like a little wrist stump there, something.
Yeah, wrist stump. There we go. That is the word for today, wrist stump. So, or is that 2 words? I don't know. But
we can make most of the word.
Most of the gags revolve around the contrast between the Addams family and normal people. They delight in macabre interests and activities which disturb and scare off the outside world. So, like, for example, they love gloomy weather. So behind me here on the YouTube version, you can see there's some gloomy weather outside, and it's just so wonderful. And they also like to enjoy a window view on the local graveyard. And we also have Morticia. Her hobbies include cutting the buds off of roses, and the children, you know, in addition to torturing each other, chop off the heads of their dolls. And, you know, they enjoy all of this stuff. Whereas, you know, when they encounter normal people, I think the Addams family just sort of seems like it's normal for everybody. And so they're like, oh, don't you, you know, cut the heads off of your dolls too? And the, you know, normal people are looking at them like, you're crazy, you're crazy.
Yeah, they're definitely oblivious to how the outside world sees them.
Yeah.
They're just kind of like, they're also super wealthy, which is something that will come up in the story as well. But
yep. They also live, of course, they're super wealthy. They live in a mansion, actually a haunted mansion, because, you know, that's the best kind of mansion when you're the Addams family. But in the 1970s animated series, the Addams family actually bought what was called a creepy camper, which is a recreational vehicle that resembled their mansion and seemingly just had as much room inside. Like, it looks like a regular, you know, oversized vehicle, but then when you go inside, it's like the size of a house. Another cartoony thing.
That's bigger on the inside.
Exactly. They used it to pack the whole family together and some kooky pets so they could travel around the country helping folks they meet along the way. So I think that was a, you know, invention to get them to be able to be mobile versus, you know, everything having to come to their house. Because eventually, you know, the neighbors all know that they're crazy and they're going to stay away. So how many, you know, strangers will show up in your doorstep? How do we get them to interact with new people? Oh, I know. Let's put their house on wheels.
Yeah, and I think that worked pretty well for the stories that we reviewed today. We can get more into it when we get into our story analysis, but before that, everybody check out this short clip, and we will be right back to discuss issue number 1. So before we get into today's story, I think I know the answer to this, but what was your background with the Addams family prior to this comic?
Yeah, I think most of us who are born in the 80s are probably going to say the Addams Family movies from the early 90s.
Yeah, the 90s movies are definitely my introduction to the characters as well. So I remember them being very funny, but the comedy also having almost like a sinister undertone to it, where they would occasionally ramp the violence up just a little bit more than what I would have expected at the age I was watching that. Particularly like the play scenes with Wednesday in, well, the first and second movie. I think she has a some sort of like school production or play that's like really goes shockingly awry. So
yeah.
But yeah, that was my introduction to them.
It's interesting as you know, research this and kind of get more into it, you know, it goes further and further back, like we said, all the way back to 1938. Like, these characters have been around for quite a while. So we have the animated TV series that, is what our comic is based on today from the 70s. There was also the black and white TV series I mentioned from 64 to 69. Charles Addams actually worked in close collaboration with the scriptwriters on the tone for the characters. And when they received first names and, everything, they were called the Addams Family for the first time. So that version is really more of like his evolution of the characters versus what came later where he was not involved as much. But it's interesting to note that Cousin It, who is a dwarf fully covered with hair, was created by a TV producer and not Charles Addams.
Okay.
So, an original character, but not by Charles Addams himself.
I was
they've
gonna
added more.
I know one thing that I noticed, there are some like late 2000s, maybe even 2010s animated movies that they did, and the style of the character design there is very much like the 1970s character design in these comics.
Yeah.
So it seems like that, at least in animation, that sort of like art direction has kind of been carried through the years.
There's actually been quite a lot in the, sort of modern era. There was more than I had realized. So there was an animated series in 1992. There was a live action reboot in 1998 that got terrible reviews.
Oh, wow.
There was a musical adaptation in 2009 that was actually very successful. There was a YouTube comedy series in 2013 about a grown-up Wednesday Addams in everyday situations. And they actually received a cease and desist letter from the Charles Addams estate due to copyright infringement. There's also, yeah, exactly. There's also been animated films, as you mentioned, 2019 and 2021 that were both successful at the box office. I think the first movie, what was it? I didn't write it down, but it was like 24 million to produce the first movie, and they made like 240 million or something.
Oh,
so
wow.
They made plenty of money back from that. So we may see another one of those. And then, of course, current, we have the spin-off series about Wednesday Addams as a young adult titled Wednesday that appeared on the streaming service Netflix in late 2022, directed by Tim Burton. And I kind of feel like as long as Tim Burton's been around, how have we not got Tim Burton and the Addams Family together sooner? Seems like a good fit.
That blows my mind. As I was watching the show, particularly the first 4 episodes are all actually directed by him, even though I think he produced the whole thing. But there are so many shots, even later in the show, that I'm like, from a production design standpoint or a costuming standpoint, I'm like, oh, look, there's a spiral on the umbrella, or there's a, just the design of things is very Tim Burton-y, but it fits perfectly in that Addams Family world, and it doesn't feel out of place. Yeah. And in fact, the Barry Sonnenfeld movies in the 90s kind of had a little bit of a Tim Burton influenced look to them. I know that it wasn't by him, but it definitely felt influenced by his work. So yeah, I don't know. It blows my mind that he was never involved with this property before that.
Yeah.
So did you feel like the characters were pretty consistent with what you've come to expect from those media adaptations that you've seen?
Well, for the most part, yes. Although Wednesday, I think, was a big change in the 90s films because from then on, she was kind of more of the stoic, like she doesn't smile. And even when she's happy, she's just like, I'm really excited about this. This is great. This is wonderful. Just like very, very stoic. And I think that was a change that they made in those movies. Whereas prior to that, she was kind of more of like the normal, a loose, normal term of like a young kid who's just like she's interested in things that most kids aren't interested in because of the nature of the Addams Family. But she was kind of the biggest difference. And Gomez, like, I don't know, like his look was interesting, but in the animated series itself, the voice actor that plays him, he's got this like really high-pitched voice and he sounds like this, and he's like,
of course, it's my great-great-great-great-granddaddy, Van Dyke Addams. He helped purchase Manhattan from the Indians.
So I couldn't read the comic and not hear that in my head. And just...
Oh my gosh, that's so funny. I was imagining Raul Julia's voice whenever I was reading the comic, because I haven't seen it.
Yeah, exactly. Very bombastic,
the very like
excitable,
dramatic, over the top, that kind of thing. Wednesday was the character that threw me off the most in these comics as well. But again, we're just coming off the Netflix show, which it has a comedic tone to it, and that mostly comes from her playing off of normal people, you know, like they do with the Addams Family a lot. However, it also has this kind of like dark undercurrent of a murder mystery drama going on as well. So I think that played things a little bit straighter, and because of the source material they were going with, that was just a more serious toned show. Well, I don't want to say that it's not funny, because it is. Particularly the episode where Uncle Fester shows up and Fred Armisen is playing him, and he's just like way over the top.
Yeah.
But it also had a lot of like intrigue and, you know, sort of the murder mystery drama, and then of course her trying to get along with her roommate and all that stuff too. So yeah, Wednesday in this story feels much more innocent. Like she's just like, I'm a little girl, but I want a pet monster and I want to, you know, play with knives and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But she wasn't like emotionally sedate or anything, which is very much how she is in the, you know, the Christina Ricci portrayal, and then also Jenna Ortega's portrayal is very much that way too. So,
yep.
So another thing that stuck out to me was just the art style of it. And I know this is the 1970s, so it's going to look dated, but did you feel like this looked very Hanna-Barbera? Because that was one of my big takeaways from this. Was I was like, this kind of reminds me of like Scooby-Doo and sort of like animation from that time. So.
Yeah. So there actually is a Scooby-Doo. I don't remember if it's around that time or if it was a little bit later, but there is an episode of Scooby-Doo animated where they have the Addams Family there. So that's another interesting crossover. That was after the show had ended, so there wasn't really much going on between like the late 70s and the 90s when the movies came out, except for like that. But anyway, to answer your question, yeah, this looks like almost like it could be a storyboard for the animated show, or they took the animated show and they paused it and they just took key frames and they dumped it into a comic. Like I was kind of surprised that there was an actual like comic artist on this book, because it seemed like they just had the animators, just downloaded into a book essentially.
Yeah, it very much looks like a cartoon style, down to the way they sort of trim down details to make things easier for animation and things like that. Like the designs are very like simplified. I mean, I guess a more modern example, it's not really modern anymore, but a more modern example of that would be like the change that they made between Batman the Animated Series season 3 and 4, where they changed all the designs to make them easier to animate. This looks like something that was intended for animation. So yeah.
Gomez, beloved.
What is it, Carita Mia?
I've just realized, darling, there must be 2 Bula Bulas in the world.
Of course.
And we've been responsible for keeping them apart.
Why, you're right, Morticia. We must find those 2 kind men and make them a present of this new companion for their pet.
So the first issue, In Search of the Bula Bula.
Bula Bula!
Which I did. I looked up the Bula Bula, by the way, to see if it was some sort of real like cryptid or mythical monster, but I couldn't find anything on the internet. So I think it's invented just for this story. There was reference to some song, Bula Bula, or something like that, but I couldn't find an actual creature online except associated with the comic. So
it's basically just a fuzzy octopus.
Yeah, it's an octopus with fur. That's what it is. But Wednesday sees an old newspaper ad for the swamp creature, the Bula Bula, and asks her parents if she can have one. So not being able to deny his child anything, Gomez and the family head to Miami to Pookie's pet store, where the owner's initial horror at their appearance turns into joy when Gomez gives him $10,000 in a cash advance for the capture of a Bula Bula. Seeing dollar signs, the hunter, anything for $1 Frank, concocts a plan to steal the family's octopus, Ocho, and dress it up like a Bula Bula. But at every turn, Frank's plans are foiled as Wednesday and Pugsley find the real monster themselves, and the family's behavior continues to baffle everyone around them. Eventually, realizing the Bula Bula is pregnant, the Addams family leave the monster, but not before they scare off Frank and his con artist friend, and also recover the thousands of dollars they'd thrown at him for his services. Yeah, I think when they're scared at the end, they like throw the suitcase of money up in the air, and so they don't end up leaving with any of it. But
Because they
Yeah,
think they're coming back to blow the lid on, you know, their deception. They're like, oh no, they figured it out. Like, we gotta go. And they like start trudging through the swamp to get away. And then they get captured anyway. And they're like, here, take the money. And they run. Yeah.
right. So this is very much I mean, it just felt like a 20-minute animated cartoon episode, which I guess is what it is.
Yep.
But because of that, there were a lot of like visual gags and jokes, even with the art. And I didn't know if you had like any favorite gags or anything from that first issue. I mean, I had a couple, but
It's really weird because like seeing the comic version, especially the comic version of something that's already animated, like if you go online and watch this episode, it'll pretty well be, you know, 99% probably, maybe 95 of what the comic has in it. So it's weird because it like sort of loses something in translation when it's, you know, printed on a page and it was already in a different format. Like I would have wanted to see them sort of, you know, invent their own sort of version of how do these gags look and how do they act. And I don't remember which issue it is, but there's one where like the car that they, you know, have their mansion on, like gets up on stilts and is really tall and it just like drives over traffic. I think that's the one where they go to New York and then it like turns around and, you know, that works really well in animation because it's a cartoon and it's like completely unrealistic, but seeing it in print, just for some reason, it didn't work quite as well for me. It wasn't as funny. And another thing with the animated series too is like they have that like track laughter in the, you know, like they do for sitcoms. So, you know, when you're reading the comic, it's like really quiet and you're like, that's funny. Whereas, you know, you're watching the animated series and like Gomez looks at the camera and he's like, oh boy. And then you hear the laughter, you know, it's a very different dynamic between the animated series and the comic. So going from one to the other, the gags didn't quite land as well for me, you know, reading the comic version.
I think the ones that worked the best for me were more dialogue related. Like at one point they're treating Frank and his con artist friends to some food because they find them out in the wilderness. Those guys were up to no good, but the Addams family is completely oblivious to this for the whole this whole issue. Like they have no idea there's any ill intent or anything. They're like, man, Frank is doing a great job. Not only did he find the Bula Bula for us, but he also found our missing octopus. Well, they stole the octopus.
Yeah.
That's what went on. But they sit them down and they're like, have some of Granny's bile stew. And so I'm just like, this is pretty disgusting. Like they're making them drink bile with the family. And they're, you know, the Addams family are all sitting there like, oh, this is great. Good. And the what is it, like Frank and his buddy, I don't know if he has a name, they like dump it into the bush behind them and it actually makes the real Bula Bula back there like all woozy and then it sort of stumbles out. So I could definitely see a lot of this stuff working really well with animation with like sound effects and voice acting and all of that. I could definitely see what they were driving at, but it is a really bizarre choice to take something from the medium where it moves and then put it into that still format when they're both drawn by hand. It's so similar in its presentation, but it's not actually moving. So you are losing the actor's performance and you're also losing the actual movement of everything. So I don't know. I also there was some dialogue towards the end where Gomez and Morticia are like, you know, now that we have the Bula Bula, we could make Wednesday even happier by breaking her heart and not giving it to her. And she's like, oh, you've made me the happiest girl in the world. And I'm just like, what is going on here? She's like, you haven't broken my heart in forever. And they're like, no, you were about due or something like that. So the dialogue at least was funny for me.
Yeah.
And I didn't have, did you actually go back and watch the animation then?
I did, yes.
More familiarize yourself with it? Okay. I can see if you were coming at it from that angle, how it would definitely not be as enjoyable. But
it's funny too, because like I really do like how they captured, you know, in any version, like the Addams family being the core centric to the story and how they react to the world. And like Gomez is like, here, I'll give you 5,000 for a bula bula. And the guy's like, oh, you know, like 5,000. Wow. And Morticia's like, oh, you've embarrassed him. And he's like, oh, okay. Here's 10,000 and I'll give you 20,000 more. Like, they're just like the way, it's almost like the way that, you know, the real world works is different for them, not just in their perception, but in reality. Like, they have this crazy fortune that they just, you know, spend left and right. I mean, Gomez, I think in almost all 3 issues, is just like dumping money here left and right.
Yeah.
And, you know, the things that they eat, like Grandma Mom makes like yuck or something drink, and the car runs out of gas, and they're like, we can use some of this yuck stuff, and you know, that'll work for gasoline too, and things like that. And it's like, they can eat these things and it doesn't hurt them. You know, they can drink bile soup and they're not, you know, it's not revolting, but it also doesn't burn them. It doesn't cause them distress, or if it does cause them distress, they enjoy it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's kind of the fun part of it, is it's so crazy fictional, because the characters not only enjoy these things that, you know, most of us don't enjoy, but they actually work better for them. Like, if they were to eat something that's like healthy for you and I, it would be revolting and probably make them sick.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. That reminds me of Addams Family Values, where they've got Fester in that mansion that I can't think, is his wife's name Debbie or whatever, that she's done up, and it's all in like pastels and everything. And Morticia's just horrified at how like normal and suburban it looks.
Or in Wednesday, when you have like the dorm room and like half of it is like the pink, you know, bright colored, and then the other half is just dark and goth, and
there's like that line,
clear line.
Yeah. It is a lot of fun to see them play off of regular characters. And I think and this is obviously a decision made for the animated series, but I think it was smart to put them on the road, because I think that does give them lots of opportunities to run into different characters and play off of quote unquote normal people everywhere they go. So yeah, the first one was very much about the you know, the con artist was trying to get money out of them for this monster, and you know, they are falling for it completely, but their ways are so strange and they're so frightening. Like, they keep like a lion, a crocodile, and an octopus as a pet, that the con artists end up being terrified and leaving anyway. So, but the Addams family at no point is ever like clued into what's going on. Like, they're all just like, oh, these people are wonderful, they're accepting us, and of course this man will take, you know, $30,000 and find the monster.
Sure, of course. Oh, but you know what? He might need some help, so we should find it ourselves too.
Yeah, I know. It's
well, and isn't that the same shtick that they use in issue 2 as well?
Yeah, so that made me start to be a little bit worried when I got to issue 2, because now we're playing the Addams family off of con artists again. And I was like, oh, is that going to be the formula for like every single issue? Fortunately, that turned out not to be the case, but it does have a lot of similar kind of story tropes, which I guess if it's like a Saturday morning cartoon or something, maybe they were like, it doesn't matter. We can kind of recycle plot points. But the second issue is In Visit to Fun City.
Just think, Gomez, our very first visit to New York City.
Good old New York, with its smog, riots, stick-ups, and hijackings.
I can certainly see why they call it Fun City.
So in this one, the Addams family visits New York City, and after a long chase through the Lincoln Tunnel involving a fog machine that they activate, by the way, they end up in Central Park. Once there, they pay Benny the Bum, thinking he's the landlord, to stay the night in his trailer park. Together with the help of Benny's associate, Mr. Ripoff, Benny sells the Natural History Museum to the Addams family. And so hijinks ensue as the family floods the museum, digs a moat around Central Park, and even frees all the animals at the New York Zoo. The police come to arrest the family for their property damage, but discover a lost deed linking Central Park to Gomez's ancestor, Van Dyke Addams. tucked away in his jacket, which just conveniently was there in his
Yeah.
jacket when they
I
see
carry
him.
this around.
Right.
Don't you?
The family decides not to sue the city for arresting them as long as they meet Wednesday's one condition, that they have to free all the zoo animals for 1 day a year to roam around Central Park. So that's probably an even more ridiculous story than the first one, but I don't know. Did you have any thoughts on that?
It's kind of funny because like freeing the zoo animals. So like I think they were going to take 1 or 2 as pets, and then Uncle Fester just like gets carried away, unlocking all of the cages, and suddenly they're like, all the animals are on the loose. They're just running rampage through New York City and that kind of thing. But this one was I think a little more fun, maybe because the whole family had more to do and they were kind of like together going through the motions of the story, versus the last one where it was just focused on like the bula bula thing and the deception back and forth. And it's like, let's take the octopus, let's dress up the octopus. Whoop, here's the real one. Whoops, it's pregnant. And it's just like that one I think lacked a little bit for me, but this story felt a little more cohesive, and them going from, you know, one scene to the next of like, you know, Mr. Ripoff and his friend there, you know, selling things to them, because they don't know, they have all this money and they're like, when I show up and I want to buy something, I mean, I just throw cash at it. Like, what's the big deal? And so, you know, they see people and they just assume, well, if I throw enough cash at it, I'll own it. Okay, great. You know, this is ours now. And they just kind of get like strung along. And it's got a very cartoony ending where they really should get arrested and go to jail, but instead, you know, they win in the end. And not only that, but they get this, you know, crazy request, like you said, freeing the zoo animals for 1 day a year. So that was kind of a weird, like, who, you know, came up with that and why was that their thing that they wanted? But I guess
know.
Wednesday, like, she likes these pets and cares about the animals, so she's sort of like the Hermione Granger of, you know, let's set the house elves free, so I guess we're gonna set the zoo animals free in the same regard. So
yeah, I know. I was surprised
that was fun
that they didn't just add the animals to like their entourage, because they've already got a lion and an octopus and a crocodile, so why not have one of every animal, you know, traveling with them? I thought this one was a lot of fun too. There were a lot of jokes that I felt landed a little bit better for me. Like the guard at the museum is like, oh gosh, what did he say? Gomez is like, well, we own the Natural History Museum, so we can come in. And he's like, yeah, and I'm the king of Mesopotamia. And Morticia's like, you are? We need to get you to the Egyptology exhibit. And so she like grabs him and starts like running him through the museum. And then there's a big display of a whale that I guess is still alive. I don't know, because they fill up this glass case with water. It floods the museum, and then the whale comes out and like eats somebody, doesn't it? It's like I believe somebody actually gets swallowed by the whale in this story. So I don't know. I might have to go back and look at it.
Yeah.
But anyway, a lot of just sort of goofy hijinks, and I can see really well how this would work for animation. And also, yeah, it moves from plot point to plot point a little more. I don't want to say logically, but it's got better cartoon logic than like the first story, where it's just kind of like back and forth between the con man and the family, and this one you feel like the family is kind of doing more too. So I don't know, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, and in the first one too, like having their mobile house didn't really seem to matter as much. I mean, they drove down to Miami, I guess, so that was the thing, is they could be on location. But really, that whole story could have took place in like a single location, whereas this one was like there was more to do. There were, you know, visiting New York City, and maybe, you know, that was the other thing too, is like maybe each episode they travel to a different, you know, place in the U.S. because I think maybe it's issue 3, but one of them they're heading to Hawaii somehow. Maybe it was this one.
I think that was the first one. They're heading to Hawaii, and then Wednesday's like, well, no, I want a bula bula, and Gomez is like, nothing's too you know, out of reach for my daughter. And so then they turn around and start heading to Miami instead. My question is, how are they going to drive to Hawaii? But
they probably could. They would have a way. The car would either get long enough that they would be driving on the sea floor, or it would float, or there'd be the Loch Ness monster would come escort them. It would be something.
Yeah, it's funny. You can't really apply any kind of normal story logic to this, because that's not what it's trying to be. It's very much trying to be like just making jokes and stuff like that. So
but it's very
um
serious to them. Like it's all like jokey and crazy, you know, maybe
mhm.
unrealistic situations. But the Addams family, they're kind of naive in that respect, where they don't really know how the world works. They're just like, you know, in their own bubble of, well, this is how things operate, and so I'm gonna, oh, we're gonna buy this museum. Okay, great. Hey, we own it now. So yeah, hey, I'm the new owner. All right, you know, not thinking anything to the contrary, or like, maybe I need to go down to the courthouse. Do I need to sign something? No, gentlemen's
Like, no.
agreement's good enough.
Yeah. Well, they bought Central Park too, so
Oh
I
yeah, yeah.
mean
And dug a moat, the
yeah,
Erie
yeah.
Canal.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that joke was very funny to me when Granny's like, she pours some, what is it? It's swamp mix. I think it's
Ah,
something that they
something.
added to the water to add creepy sea creatures to it in the moat.
Hmm.
And it was like a powder, and then it turned into like electric eels and other stuff. And she's like, that's one Erie Canal. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, that's a dad joke worthy of me right there. So
I can hear the actress from the 90s movies being like, it's the Erie Canal.
oh yeah, 100%. And yeah, I also just like that Fester was more involved in this one, because like him just bringing a little bit of chaos to the situation. Nobody asked him to start digging a moat. He just did it. And then
Mhm.
also, the minute that Granny started complaining that her complexion wasn't good in sunlight, he's like, "Oh, let's activate this giant fog machine and like cover the entire car in fog so that they can't see." So they're driving through this dark tunnel and they can't see anything. And once they get to like New York City, you see like this massive traffic jam, and in the center of it is just like a cloud, which is where their car is. So
Well,
I thought a lot of that stuff worked.
even without the fog machine, they have that like storm cloud that's over the
Oh
top of their house
yeah, I
anyway.
forgot about
And I was like,
that.
just lower that a little bit or make it rain or something. But
Exactly.
And now, the moment we've all been waiting for. America's newest and greatest country rock sensation. Freddie and the Frog.
So in issue 3, Left in the Lurch, Lurch has been writing letters to a pen pal named Bonnie Joe in Nashville, Tennessee. But he told her that he's a rock star. So unfortunately for Lurch, the family is heading to Nashville in order to get some used dinosaur bones to complete Fester and Pugsley's collection. They've built it looks like part of a triceratops, but Fester put the head on the tail because they didn't have the neck bones, and Pugsley
mm.
was like, "Where can we go to get more bones?" And so Fester opens his shirt, and magically there's a map of the United States on it, and then they're like, "Oh, let's go to Nashville." Uh, so basically, Wednesday finds out that Lurch has been lying to his pen pal Bonnie Joe, and the family, which this actually surprised me, the family is like, "Well, now you shouldn't fib, Lurch. That's very bad." I expected them to be like, "Oh, that's very good," or because
Hmm.
everything's been so bizarro world. But they do then decide to help him by forming a rock band called Freddie and the Frogs. So the family begins publicity for Freddie and the Frogs once they get to Nashville. Lurch gets himself arrested, actually, because he's so ashamed of the idea of performing. And in fact, he tries to get arrested multiple times and they won't do it. So he actually breaks into jail. And then that's when they're like, "You're arrested." So it's like, okay, whatever. But Gomez is not having this. So he buys Lurch's freedom with $2,000 because that's what he does. He throws money at everything and explains that Lurch merely has to lip sync. He doesn't need to actually sing. But unfortunately, after Lurch gets too into the song and starts tapping his feet, he breaks the stage. And Gomez reveals that he won't ever be able to sing again, at which point Bonnie Joe rejects him since he's not a celebrity. So Gomez remarks that they should all write, "I'll never pretend to be somebody I'm not 1,000 times." And thus our story ends. This one had a moral at the end. So there
It
you go.
did. Well, and it's really funny because, like, as you pointed out, like they are not into deception. They're not into, you know, anything that's actually like nefarious, or like if they knew that these guys were deceiving them, they probably would have punished them in some like horrible means.
Oh yeah.
But because they were naive and didn't realize it, the story turned out differently. But in this one, like they catch Lurch in a lie, and that's a big issue. Like Morticia's like, normally we would, what does she say? We would disown you, or we would kick you out.
Yeah, it was
something.
It was something really severe.
Yeah, but they were understanding because of the situation and allowed him to continue anyway. But and it was funny too, like with Lurch trying to get arrested, because he's like trying to, I think he smacks a cop's motorcycle or something, and he's like, oh, thank you, it was having trouble running, but now it's running smoothly, because he like hit it so hard that whatever was lodged in there became loose, and now the motorcycle is working, and things like that. And he's like, how do I get arrested so I don't have to go go on stage? And finally just breaks into the jail to get in jail so they can keep him away. But he had a lot of trouble getting in there. It's funny because this would have been the one that I wish I would have watched the animated version of before reading the comic, because the other two, I felt like it kind of spoiled it when I read the comic. And so then this one, I was like, I'm not going to watch the animated one first. I'm just going to read the comic first. And then I read this and I was like, I want to watch the animated version because there's a song in it.
Yeah.
Like they actually play this whole musical number with Gomez singing and Lurch lip syncing and all this stuff, and be interesting.
And Morticia playing the spiderweb harp, and Pugsley playing the skeleton drums. And
like the bone xylophone by Uncle Fester.
Yeah, they all have instruments, but they have to have like a creepy spin on them. So that was fun to see as well. I think the main problem I had with this one is that Lurch, he looks like an old undead guy, and Bonnie Jo looks clearly like a teenage girl. And I'm just like, why is that his pen pal? Why is he trying to impress her by telling her that he's a rock star and all this stuff? And I know that it's a kid's show or a kid's comic, and you're not supposed to read that much into it. But reading it as an adult in 2023, it didn't read very well. So that was the only thing that was like distracting to me about this one. But yes, I'm totally with you. I 100% wanted to hear their rock song. I was wanting to look up the episode afterwards because I was like, oh man, I've got to hear like what crazy thing did they come up with in the 70s to, for their musical number. So.
Yeah, it's funny because like, any creepiness aside and, anything like that, like Lurch talking to this girl, like what would they actually write about? Is he just like, I am rock star, I am famous, just like basic things? And she's just like, because we know at the end of the story, especially, that she is super shallow.
Yes.
So, he could probably write something very boring, but because of, supposedly who it's coming from, she's going to think that it's like, some big to do. But I just wonder, like, obviously this isn't real, but if it was, I would be interested to know what the letters say. Like, what would Lurch is he actually a poet at heart, and he's writing her these, beautiful sonnets of like, I'm a rock star, but I will, tone down my rock for you and write these like beautiful sonnets, kind of like Gomez and Morticia.
I would like to rock you to sleep in your eternal grave. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that too. Like, wouldn't that come up at some point of like, oh, like, come share a bat with me, or I don't know, just something like kooky, and her being like, what does that mean? But
kooky, interesting choice of language there.
And ooky, and mysterious and spooky.
She actually says that she left her boyfriend at one point for Lurch too, which she's like, I can't believe I left my boyfriend for him. He's not even a celebrity anymore. And I'm just like, wow, Bonnie Jo, like you are not a great person.
No.
Yeah, I was there. The moral at the end was like, you shouldn't lie about who you are. But I was thinking like a secondary message could be like, maybe don't make time for people that don't accept you for who you are and that want you to pretend to be somebody else, because like that wouldn't have been fulfilling anyway. And I know I'm bringing like modern relationship knowledge into a 1970s animated series based comic book, and that's probably not appropriate, but yeah, I don't know. I don't think Lurch would have won if he ended up with Bonnie Jo anyway. So
Yeah, there's no way, even if he was honest about who he was, that's not a relationship that seems like it would work very well. But you know, if they wanted to make it more of like a modern believable adaptation, it could kind of be like The Thing, and what's his girlfriend? Is it
Oh,
Alicia?
Alicia
Alicia.
Masters, yeah.
So they could do something like that where Lurch has a girlfriend, and maybe they do
Yeah.
in the 1960s show. I don't know. I haven't really
Yeah, I don't know. I
seen that,
actually
but
was surprised at how much dialogue he had, because I thought that
yeah.
Lurch just kind of went, you know, and just kind of like groaned and stuff like that. You can definitely clip that out and you know,
Mhm.
add beats to it and make a whole
Yeah.
song. And I'm sure that's coming in the future. See, there it is. It writes itself. But I don't remember him having dialogue in the 90s movies at all. But that's unfortunately my only real basis for comparison, because I didn't see the 1960s show.
Mhm. In the cartoon, he's just like, okay, I'll drive there now. You know, it's just like really super
yeah.
deep and barely understandable. So,
Very,
I
very
mean,
limited.
him having dialogue in the show is a little more in line with it versus, you know, reading it on a page. It's a lot more clear what he's saying.
Yeah, I wonder why the 60s show was not like on Nick at Night when we were kids, because the Munsters was. And I
Mhm.
remember I've seen a lot of the Munsters just randomly because it was on TV on Nick at Night around that time, but I never remember seeing an episode of the Addams Family. So I don't know if
Yeah,
it just wasn't as big, or like what the deal was there.
I don't know.
So I guess if we're ready to move into final thoughts,
Yeah, let's move into final thoughts.
comics.
Comics.
Before we try and do some kind of a number rating for this overall, did you have one of the stories that stuck out as your favorite more than the others?
It's kind of tough to choose because they're all pretty similar. The first two being very similar. The third one is at least different enough, and it had a moral to it. So I would maybe pick the third one. Although for a comic, you know, having a rock song in it is not as fun as like an animated show or live action version. So I
Right.
think that would have made it better as if it wasn't a comic. But yeah, probably the third one. What about you?
Yeah, well, it's funny because I initially had thought the third one, and then as we talked about how fun the second issue was, I was like, you know, maybe that is my favorite. But
Hmm.
yeah, the third one felt like more of a complete story that had like sort of like a conflict, and then we deal with the conflict, and then it has a resolution, and it felt like more of a complete tale than the other ones, where it felt like this isn't exactly so much a story as it is just an excuse to tell jokes, which I
Mhm.
realize is like
Yeah.
90, if not 100% of the point. But yeah, the third one felt like more of a story, quote unquote. So I would have to go with that as well. Um, the other thing, and I can answer this first, but was there a character that you thought that they should have highlighted more? Because for me, that was Wednesday, because I'm so used to seeing her front and center, both in the 90s movies. I think because Christina Ricci was already a name before she was cast in that. She was very much like a central part of those movies. And then of course she had her own TV show. And I just felt like she was mostly backgrounded for these issues. I don't know. How did
Hmm.
you feel about that?
I kind of wanted a little bit more of Morticia. Like she was
Hmm.
in the story, but she didn't really have anything, you know, of her own. I think that she was really doing, and it's so funny, like the over the top romanticism that she and Gomez have in the '90s movies. It's just like, you know, gross. Mom and Dad are, you know, again, but they're so just over the top, and like they use the dramatic camera angles and the lights. So like, you know, they darken everything except for her eyes, and so you just see her
Yeah.
eyes in one frame of the movie, and she's just like so gorgeous, and he's just like, I would kill for her, I would die for her, and either way, what bliss. And he's just like over the top, like goofy romantic. And so that was a fun, you know, part of those movies that I enjoyed. I don't think it would have fit necessarily in a kid's show because all the kids would have been like, ew, you know, that kind
It's
of thing.
very true.
but still, like, Morticia being more front and center as a character, because I feel like we highlight Wednesday and we highlight Gomez a lot, but we don't really highlight Pugsley and we don't highlight Morticia. So I'd like to see
Yeah,
more of
that's
that.
true. I don't think Pugsley really gets a lot of focus in anything that I've seen. He's always kind of
He's
the
basically a punching bag.
yeah, for Wednesday. I mean, that's
Yeah,
basically what he is. So it's the little brother that she can bully, but other people are not allowed to bully.
that's right.
So
Otherwise, you'll get piranhas chasing after you in a swimming
yeah,
pool.
exactly. Yeah, that was quite an opening scene for the Netflix show. I was
Yeah.
like, oh, this is going a little bit darker than I expected. I should have known, with Tim Burton that it would, but
Mhm.
yeah, so speaking about the comic specifically, it's really hard to give a number rating to something that is really intended as more of a funny pages book or even as a cartoon. I do feel like the premise of adapting a cartoon to a comic book already is kind of a flawed premise and not a good idea,
Yeah.
because if you're just translating those character designs and then you're also translating the story, what's the point when you could just go watch it and you're going to get a more fulfilling experience out of it?
Mhm.
I can think of instances like Batman The Adventures Continue, which is something that DC publishes, which is very much set in the Batman the Animated Series universe and Earth. And so all that continuity that came with Justice League and all that is intact in these comics, but they're new stories dealing with Batman in that animated series universe. That makes more sense to me than to do like a one-to-one translation of like a cartoon to comic book. So while I don't think that the premise was really something worth doing, um, the implementation wasn't necessarily bad. So I don't know. I mean, I guess if I'm being generous, I would give this a 3. Otherwise, I would say probably a 2.5, like right down the middle, because what they did was completely competent. I just don't think that what they did was worth doing necessarily. So
Well, and you have to ask yourself, like, okay, so back in the 1970s, what was the aim of this comic? Was it to bring
sure.
on new readers? Well, you're
Mhm.
bringing on new readers so that you can sell people to watch a kid's cartoon. So
Right.
your audience probably aren't going to pick up the comic to read it and then jump into the cartoon because they're kids,
Right.
right? So
Right.
I don't really know what the point of this would be. If you're trying to
Mhm.
lure adults in, well, again, it's a cartoon. So make it more
Right.
like mature, not, like today's standards, like when something's rated M, it's like really rated M. But, for the 1970s standards, make it a little bit more adult, give it something more for the adults to get into and say, hey, there's some enjoyment I can get in this as well as, the kids. And so when I watch the cartoon, yeah, it's goofy and it's kooky and ooky and, all that stuff. But there's some part of it that, I can get into and I can enjoy. But I felt like this
Mhm.
comic gave us none of that. It was really just literally like I could go to the cartoon, I could save frames in the cartoon, and I could download those, print them out, and then I could write, the dialogue on there, and ta-da, I've made a comic book. Like, yeah,
Right. Right.
that's easier to do in, 2023 than it is in 1970, but the point's still there. Like, why would you take something that already exists and then just put it into this format without
Right.
any changes? Like, as far as I could tell from the episodes, there really weren't any changes, maybe a bit of dialogue here and there, but nothing that, really impacted the story at all. So I'm with you on this, but at a point lower. If I'm generous, I'll
Oh,
give this
okay.
2 because the Addams Family is like a great creation. They're very interesting, they're fun,
Mhm.
but this comic I could have done without. Like why does
Yeah,
it
I think I'm gonna stick with 2.5 for mine. I don't think I can go higher than that because I just think that the premise itself is flawed of doing a comic
Mm,
book of a cartoon and just doing a one-to-one. I think there are so many things that we've seen, and like the comic book that I mentioned earlier, Batman: The Adventures Continue. There's also the Star Trek Generations comic that we reviewed, and so okay, yes, they're translating a movie to a comic book, but they had a whole bunch of deleted scenes and things that were not in the movie. So it
mhm.
has value outside of it just being a different media form of the same thing. It
Yeah.
actually was different. It actually does give you some insight into the story and things that you wouldn't experience otherwise. So, yeah, I feel like this comic just didn't bring anything new. That being said, I'm giving it that extra 0.5 because it didn't portray the characters in a bad light. I don't feel like it was an unfaithful adaptation. It just wasn't really terribly exciting either. So
Yeah. Well,
2.5 for
and
me.
even with like Star Trek Generations, they almost
Mhm.
had to make up the story in the comic because they couldn't watch the entire movie and dump it in there. So they were
Right.
kind of just guessing based on the information, and it played out a little bit differently in some scenes. And they had, like you mentioned, deleted scenes. So I felt
Mhm.
like that one, let me give the creator some credit. But again, here it's
Yeah.
like you just I don't know. So
Yeah. It didn't
I
require a lot of thought or effort to
yeah,
put this together.
I think I'm going to stick with a 1.5 on this
Oh,
one.
all
It's
right. All right. Man,
just
that might be our lowest score ever. That's
I think
crazy.
and it's funny because, like, it's a cartoon, and the why did it exist, and that's what makes it
Sure.
that low score for me, not
Mhm.
actually the characters, because the characters are great. It's just the stories,
Yeah.
it's just a copy and paste.
Yeah, it ends up being a whole lot of nothing when I think in a comic book format there is an expectation that you get a little bit more meat than what these issues have to. I feel
Hmm.
like this is very much an experience that you could I mean, for me to read all 3 of them and do a critical analysis of them took me maybe like an hour to an hour and a half. If I was just reading them, it probably would have taken me like 20 minutes to get through them. It was just
Yeah.
the fact that I was intentionally trying to go in and find like, is there anything in here that we can talk about? That it took me much longer to get through
Right.
that process, plus all the research that goes into creators and
Yeah.
stuff like that. But
But you could do the same thing by watching the animated series, because those
exactly.
stories are there and they're animated and they're voiced and they have sound effects. So go watch
Right.
those instead. Don't read these.
Yeah, so 1.5 for you, 2.5 for me. That's going to leave this one at a 2, so I appreciate you making my math easy this
Hey, you know
time.
what? Just for
Uh
you. Cara mia.
Cara mia. Cara mia. I got to get
Cara
the
mia.
pronunciation right.
Yeah. Mon
Uh
cher.
we can talk a little bit about the films and TV shows. I mean, obviously we grew up watching the 90s movies. That's where I started, but do you have like a favorite adaptation or a favorite take on these characters that you've seen through the years?
It's really hard to not be nostalgic for the 90s movies,
Mhm.
especially I think just when they came out, and us being around, kids when we were kids, it was just one of those, like,
Mhm.
looking at it through nostalgia. So it's hard to say if any of the other adaptations, to compare them, from I think from both of our perspectives. But
Yeah.
I it's just they're so fun, and they're so, like, Gomez is so energetic. He's just like, oh, this is great, and we're doing this, and he's just so excitable, and
Oh yeah.
it really, like, lends itself to that, sort of naive nature, where he's just like, okay, I'll open my safe in front of you. No peeking. Like, everything is just fun to him. Like, he's a big kid who he likes to sword fight, and he likes to,
Mhm.
just have a good time, and, take care of his children. And, then we get Wednesday and her version of her character that's sort of like,
Mhm.
reinvented from the earlier stuff. So it's hard to compare that to a show from the 1960s that we didn't grow up
Mhm.
watching. So to go back and watch it now, I don't know if it would hold up today, especially with everything that's out now. But the Wednesday show itself is a lot of fun, although you don't get the whole family in there. You just get them when they come to visit, that sort
Yeah,
of thing. But
kind of in bits and pieces. I think we only see Pugsley like at the beginning and the end of the season, maybe,
and he
and
was, like,
he's
really
not.
quiet, wasn't
Yeah,
he?
he was real quiet. Like he didn't have
Yeah.
really much to add. Fester was probably the presence that was most like the biggest
Hmm.
presence, and he was only there for one episode, and he was like on the run from the law. Although
Yeah.
for some reason he had a motorcycle with like dog ears on it or something,
Well,
and
he
they
stole
had
it.
like dog ear helmets. Yeah.
That was fun.
He's like, I went for something inconspicuous, and Wednesday's just like, oh, okay, and
Okay.
But yeah, the 90s movies for me too are definitely, I mean, I just grew up, especially the first one. I've seen it so many times as a kid. And
Hmm.
it was one of the first movies I remember seeing where there was something that I was like, this is truly, I don't want to say adult humor, but there was almost a thrill out of like, I'm not supposed to be watching this, especially because of the scene where Wednesday gets up on stage and she's stabbing Pugsley, and then they're just like spraying blood all over the audience and everything. And
Yeah.
it just goes on for so long, and the people are screaming. And I remember being so, it was really funny at the time, but also I was the age where like I knew I wasn't supposed to be watching that, so that was part of the enjoyment from it too, because my growing up experience was very sheltered as far as what I was and wasn't allowed to watch. So I think
Mm.
I was at a friend's house staying the night. It wasn't yours, it would have been before I moved. Yeah, and we went through their movies, and I was like, "Oh, this is PG-13. Cool. Let's watch this because I'm only 9, or what, however old I was."
Mm.
So, yeah, I don't know. It made a big impression on me at the time.
Yeah.
It's actually
Well,
one of the first movies where I really remember noticing the score as well,
mm.
which is funny because I could not tell you the theme of it now, but I remember at the time thinking like, "Oh, the background music in this is really good," not even knowing the word original score, or what that
Hmm.
means.
Yeah.
So, so
Well,
yeah,
and
I've got a lot of fond memories of it. Go
yeah,
ahead, sorry.
it's fun too because they're not evil characters. They're not
Right,
in
right,
witchcraft, and they're spreading misery, and they're commiserating with demons and like hurting
right.
people. They're kind of just like, they're almost harmless to some degree, but then what's harmless to them is lethal to other people. So it's more like that, like, accidental, like, you don't let children play with knives and swords, but Wednesday and
Mhm.
Pugsley do. But it's okay for them because the type of characters that they are, they can play with knives and it can land somewhere, but they won't, they'll come back unscathed. Whereas like your, regular person sees a kid playing with knives and they're going to freak out. It's that kind of thing where they're not doing anything that's like intentionally nefarious or evil,
No.
or anything like that. They're kind of naive and sheltered in their own respect, but they appreciate things in a different light than the
They
rest of the
seem to
world.
have a very positive outlook on life, surprising,
Yeah.
well, and death, I should say.
Mm.
But but yeah, they're definitely not like downers of characters, even though they're
Yeah.
all about like, they like death and torture and killing. It's all in good fun. So I do have to say that I did really enjoy the Wednesday show on Netflix as well. I felt like it pushed it into murder mystery dramatic territory, but it didn't go like 100% all in on that, where it removed all the humor. The humor
Hmm.
was still there, but a lot of it came from sort of Wednesday's really dry, sarcastic wit and the
Yeah.
way she dealt with everybody around her. And they were maybe a little more realistic about it because they saw people start to be kind of alienated by the way she was behaving, which makes sense in a more real
Yeah.
world setting. But it still had like, even though it wasn't just comedic all throughout, it had those comedic beats, and it had a lot of nice nods to the older material. Like they had to get into the secret passage by snapping their fingers twice,
That was
just
fun.
like in the Addams Family theme song. And Thing is there with her for like the whole series, so he is getting into all kinds of shenanigans, and they even get into a fight, and Wednesday has to make it up to him, and I think Thing actually gets stabbed at one point too,
Yeah.
through the hand. So, well, I mean, where else would you stab him? But but yeah, it's a lot of fun. I think if you enjoyed the '90s movies, I think that Wednesday as a show is a good sort of companion piece, or sort of like furtherance of that.
Hmm.
And all the acting in it is very good too. So I
Yeah.
definitely enjoyed it a lot. It doesn't hold the same place in my heart as the Adams Family and Adams Family Values, because I
Hmm.
didn't grow up on it. So
Yeah. I think this is one of those where, the characters are very centric to the story, and, you know, the story that's going on outside of it is not really as important as the interaction between the characters and what the family is doing. And you can almost
mhm.
drop them into any situation and the story's going to write itself because, you know, like Wednesday, she's going to want something and her dad's going to give it to her and he's going to throw a ton of money at it. And Morticia and Gomez are going to be, you know, making out in the corner and being gross. And Uncle Fester's going to come and he's going to be the fun guy and he's going to do something like totally like, whoa, that's crazy. And, you know, just all sorts of stuff like that. So I think as long as you're watching an adaptation where they get the core of the family, you know, dynamic and the characters are portrayed well, you know, any of the adaptations that have come out are probably enjoyable to some regard. But for the ones that didn't do so well, I'm assuming they probably didn't capture the characters very well, or it was just a repeat of, because I think there was a TV movie that was a repeat of one of the shows, and it was just like they didn't do anything original. The studio didn't want anything the original. They wanted them to rehash the old stuff so they could make some money, and the critics said, you're just rehashing the old stuff but you're doing it in a crappy way, so thumbs down. And it didn't do
yeah
well.
Yeah, is that the there was like a third Addams Family movie that had a completely different cast, that was like direct to video or something. I never saw that, but I don't think it was well received either. I don't know. I mean, they couldn't have Raul Julia back because he passed away, unfortunately, shortly after Addams Family Values came out. I think Street Fighter was his last movie. And I remember him saying that he did that for his kids because I guess they were big Street Fighter fans. So he plays M. Bison in that. But and he is also extremely over the top in that. I think what's the famous line? He's like, Chun-Li is like, you murdered my father or whatever, and he's like, for you it was the most important day of your life, but for me it was a Tuesday. And I'm like, dang, like that's a great line. Sounds like a very Gomez Addams thing to say. It does, too. It does, doesn't it? So for me it was a Wednesday. Exactly. Anyway, this is going to be a very difficult comic to get a hold of if you are looking for a print copy. I actually just looked it up online, and one of the cheapest copies I could find at like mid-grade was $200 for the first issue. So if you decide to go out and read this, I would recommend that you do purchase that $200 one from our Amazon store so we can get all that money. And there you go. If you and if you want to give us more like Gomez does, hey, 5,000, 10,000, exactly, yeah, 20, however many $1,000 you want to throw at us, we're fine with. But if you are able to get a hold of the comic or find a way to read it, tell us what you thought by posting on social media at Boneless Comics 1 on Twitter and at Boneless Comics Podcast pretty much everywhere else. And be sure to use our hashtag Boneless Comics Podcast. That's right. So next episode, we're going to keep it dark with a review of Justice League Dark, The Great Wickedness, which includes Justice League 59 through 71 and Justice League Dark 2021 Annual, published in 2021 by DC Comics, written by Ram V and penciled by Hermanico, Christopher Mitten, and Sumit Kumar. Yes. And stay tuned for our after show where we're going to do something a little bit different today. And we'll talk about my experience at Planet Comic Con, Kansas City. Thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time.
And when I'm feeling blue, she's the one I'll just turn to.